And the key thing to recognise is that sometime in the next few years, unless China really is in the process of a hard landing or is going to disappear away out of significance, sometime in the next probably 3 years, the BRIC countries will become bigger than the US, which will have big political consequences as to how they all interact within the G20, and will mean, obviously, a little, if not a lot, about who should be running places like the IMF and the World Bank. And this sort of somewhat cosy arrangement of life since those organisations were established, where the US always has the World Bank because Europe always has the IMF and vice versa, those days are very close to an end. Actually, long-term growth forecasting is probably easier than short-term forecasting, because it only depends on two things. It depends on the size of the working population and its productivity. And so in that context, when people express amazement and question about whether India or China could become as big as we've become famous for saying, actually the real answer is, well, they're going to have diabolical productivity in order to stop them becoming big, because they've got more than 1 billion people. And those of you who are students of history will know, a few hundred years ago, they were 50% of world GDP anyhow. So in some ways, they are just rediscovering the beginnings of how the world share was at one stage anyhow. South Korea today has a GDP per capita which is nearly the same as a G7 country. When I was first coming into this life, and even when I was first coming into finance, South Korea had a GDP per capita similar to African countries. So they are a perfect example, if not the best example, of how the world can change in a big way. And when I do meet policymakers from many of these other countries, I'm actually meeting some from Nigeria tomorrow, and they ask me what should they do. I said, well, get on a plane to Seoul in South Korea and figure out how they did it and copy it. And again, going back to my opening comment, quite how we all think of South Korea as a developing country is in many ways, frankly, an embarrassment. I would describe the new China as one that's focused on the quality of growth as opposed to the quantity. It's no longer true that the China that we were all dealing with before the crisis is the same as the one now, just even in 4 years. And within the reasons why this slowed is obviously because there's trouble in some of their big markets like the Eurozone, but it is much more because of, in my judgment, a deliberate policy to boost wage growth, which is designed to support income growth in China. But one of the consequences is that China is increasingly losing its ability to be the cheap source of low value-added manufacturing. Mexico, in my opinion, is a huge winner of that shift. About the two biggest countries in the world, the US and China, shifting. So the US has got to be a bit less like the old US and a bit more like the old China. So consume less and produce more. And China's got to be quite a bit less than the old China and quite a bit more like the old US. So consume quite a bit more and produce quite a bit less. There is a growing school of thought, particularly encouraged by some famous hedge fund people in the States, that China is in the early stages of actually falling apart. And part of the dilemma and why it's so immediately appealing to many people who think that way is because, of course, they're a horrible bunch of communists and, of course, it can't work. What they fail to think about, and they could be true, of course, but what they fail to think about is things like this. And it is almost definitely the case, in my view, that the main reason why China has slowed the past 2 years is because the government has deliberately slowed the economy. Their concern, in contrast to ours, for the past few years, has been more about inflation, not the crisis that we all are so obsessed about over here still. As of yet, they have not eased financial conditions much. which is quite intriguing and suggests to me, and I was just in China for a couple of days last week, along with being in Japan, suggests to me that the Chinese policymakers are very happy that the economy is slowed, and they do not want to juice it up again in the way they did in 2009, because they've entered a new era where it's all about the quality of growth and less so much the quantity. Before the new millennium, even though lots of regional wild things, the US had a very stable relationship between house prices and personal income nationally. In fact, that line was as stable as it looks there for 30 years. And then the magical millennium clock ticked, and we started this, what we all now know in hindsight, insane bubble in US housing, which world policymakers have managed to basically turn into some kind of blame of Goldman Sachs and the rest of the financial sector, and not wanting to take any responsibility for their own possibly misjudged thinking themselves. But my opinion, whilst many bubbles are indeed quite difficult to identify in advance, that one was pretty clear. My opening comments. The appearance of the BRICS and the growth market economies, where they are creating the equivalent of another Italy or UK every year, not surprisingly, is transforming patterns of world trade as well. Something I've just had my guys do in the past 2 weeks, and rather intriguingly and potentially very worryingly for all those manic EMU supporters, something very disturbing. Because if we carry on with the same pattern of trade in the next 8 years that we've had the past 12, that comes to the following conclusion: that by 2020, Germany will have 25% of its exports to the BRIC countries, 15% of the total will be to China, nearly double the amount it exports to France. And I'm sure many of you who followed the theory of all this stuff, the strongest arguments as to why EMU was created, if there were economic grounds, was that the amount of trade that the European countries did with each other was so big, if you removed all the barriers, including the currency, that would result in such welfare and economic gains. We'd have this beautiful nirvana in Europe forever. It is unfortunately showing absolutely zero signs of happening. In fact, because of the rise of the BRICS, something which no creator of EMU could have dreamt of is happening is that German companies would probably rather be in a monetary union with China by the end of the decade and not with France. You can't really have a lot of countries persistently in a monetary union unless they have things that are consistent in terms of wealth levels and productivity levels. Greece's GES score is lower than that of Brazil and China, and yet it's in a monetary union with countries like the Netherlands that have some of the best GES scores out of the 180 countries we monitor. And that is the reality of the complexity and difficulty that they've created themselves by putting these 17 countries in. And one of the few things I've learned in 31 years of finance is that usually democratic countries in particular, and maybe others, don't deal with their big sovereign fiscal challenges unless the markets force them to do, and sort of never let a crisis go to waste. So I look at any emerging economy that is at least 1% of global GDP should be treated as sort of semi-adults. So in 2011, the dollar value of China's GDP increased by $1.37 trillion, which translates actually is China creating the economic equivalent of another Greece every 12.5 weeks. Despite Italy's dilemmas, as I'm sure many of you know, Italy is still the 8th largest economy in the world, and yet these guys have said, well, we can make one of those in a year. And the 8 growth market economies collectively actually did more than the UK in 1 year. In real terms, we are assuming that the growth 8 will contribute about $15 trillion to global GDP this decade, half of which is China. For all those that send me emails every other day, when am I going to drop the R in BRIC because we don't like Mr. Putin, That is fine, but if you could see this clearly, despite all Russia's considerable dilemmas and challenges, this decade there is a decent possibility that Russia will contribute more to the world economy in dollar terms than the whole of the Eurozone put together. Look at this here, you'll see that for the past 3 decades the world economy has grown by about 3.4%. And it's the numbers I just showed you, if they happen this decade, contrary to the widespread presumption that the world can never be like it has been before because of the degree of problem we've all got, actually the world economy will grow by more than 4% this decade, if what I just showed you happens. And critically, to try and understand that, that's despite the fact that we are assuming China will grow by less than it's done for the past 30 years. And so there is awareness around that China might not be able to grow going forward as much as it's done, but that leads most people to the conclusion, oh my goodness me, on top of the fact that the US is falling apart and the Eurozone is never going to have any growth ever again in the history of mankind, we are in serious trouble. I think that is, as is often the case, both in financial markets and with our media, somewhat exaggerated. And consequences from this changing world, obviously, for many, many things to do with international governance. As demonstrated, in my opinion, by the most spectacularly beautiful Olympic Games we hosted this summer, if we really sort of try to concentrate on what edges the UK does have to offer the world, which includes, in my opinion, education, we could probably do a better job of it rather than kidding ourselves that we're going to be able to out-manufacture the Germans who have been rather good at this for many, many decades.